As in other parts of Boston, there's a Dorchester angle in the results from the Super Tuesday election, along with new steps toward a cleanup from the Neponset River and concerns about COVID-19. To fill us in is the managing editor and publisher of the Dorchester Reporter, Bill Forry. Thank you very much for being with us, Bill.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be back.
Bill, I know you were following the results pretty closely as they came in on Tuesday night. By the end of the night or early the next morning, what did it look like in Dorchester?
Well, it looked like the story in Dorchester and in Boston and Massachusetts and nationally was Joe Biden's surge. And Joe Biden won Dorchester. He won Mattapan. He won Boston, of course, by a narrow margin. I think Bernie Sanders came within about 56 votes of winning in Boston. However, Biden was the story because he did win. And in Dorchester, to take this slice of the city for an example, there are about 60 precincts that constitute Dorchester. Biden won 33 of those 60, so he won the predominant precincts in the ward. Sanders won 25, so he did quite well, as he did across the city. And the other part of the story was Warren. Elizabeth Warren did not do well. Obviously, she came in third in the state. She came in third in Boston, and that was reflected in the Dorchester numbers. She only won 3 precincts in Dorchester, which is really a kind of a surprise. I think a lot of it has to do, obviously, with the Biden surge after South Carolina. And there was just attrition in her vote. I think a lot of her vote went to Biden. Is my thinking based on the numbers we've looked at. She was finishing second or third in these precincts, but these are precincts that she was winning by big margins when she was head-to-head with a Republican. In 2018, Elizabeth Warren won 80% of the city of Boston against Jeff Deal. In 2012, she won a similar margin against Scott Brown. But of course, Scott Brown and Jeff Deal weren't on the ballot on Tuesday. Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden were. And in that context, given her performance in the earlier states, given the big surge coming out of South Carolina, and with the endorsements that Joe Biden won on the eve of election, obviously the vote shifted, and Biden was the main beneficiary.
Well, when people talk about Dorchester, they talk about a lot of different kinds of sub-communities.
Yeah.
I mean, you could look at the Florian Hall, things go one way, but what about comparing that to other parts of Dorchester?
Right. That's what was most interesting to me, Chris, out of the vote in our neighborhood, was how well Biden did in a place like Florian Hall, 1612, which is still kind of an Irish Catholic enclave.
And a very high turnout precinct, too.
It is a high turnout precinct, and his margin of victory there was quite significant. He won all of the upper precincts in Ward 16, which is Neponset, essentially, and it is a white and more conservative-leaning part of the city. Can vote red sometimes, has voted for Scott Brown, has voted for Romney in some of these precincts over the years. Biden cleaned up there. He did very, very well. And the other place he cleaned up was in, predominantly black, middle-class, reliably Democratic precincts through Ward 14 in the Franklin Field area, in places like Groveland Senior Center in Ward 18, which is in Mattapan. Places like the Chittick School and Hassan Apartments in Mattapan Hyde Park, where there's a heavy Haitian vote along with an African-American vote. Biden had those same margins that he saw in Neponset there. And that says something, I think, about where this race has gone to since South Carolina. That kind of Obama-Biden coalition that existed in 2008 and 2012 for the Democrats was there for Biden on Tuesday. And I think that was a motivator for people who decided to move away from Warren, that she probably wasn't going to be a winner nationally based on polling, but also based on her performance in the early states. And when Biden won South Carolina, it did change everything for him.
What surprised me about the result, and I go back to 2008, and I remember Obama here for a rally. He's flanked by DeVal Patrick and Ted Kennedy.
Right.
A lot of establishment people, really. Mm-hmm. And now, when I look at the results here, I look at people on social media. We follow a lot of the same people, I think.
Yeah.
Not much talk about Biden. There's a lot about Warren, a lot about Sanders. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is unusual that people here. The voters, for the most, they were just acting on their own. Yeah,
they were. Look, the national dynamics were manifested on the ground here. People are paying attention to what's going on, obviously across the country. They saw what happened in Nevada. They saw what happened in New Hampshire in particular, because that was a big disappointment for Warren. Those voters who were, I think, would have probably been with her had she, had a shot of winning more states. And I did think that there might be a sympathetic vote for Warren just to make sure she won Massachusetts. But, I think the Democratic voter and the independent voter who are pulling Democrat ballots this year, are motivated by really one thing, and that's the defeat of Donald Trump. And at this point, I really think that the nuances of policy, ideology, and whether or not you know the candidate, Elizabeth Warren, I'm sure, has selfies with a lot of these voters who went in and voted for Biden on Tuesday here. She's a known quantity, and yet she didn't seem viable. And voters right now are interested in a practical solution to the November issue, which is the defeat of Trump.
I want to talk about where Sanders did better and worse. One thing I noticed in Dorchester is that some of the precincts he carried in Ward 16 4 years ago, he didn't win them this time. Same goes for some precincts in South Boston as well.
Absolutely.
How do you explain that?
Well, look, two things. One is I don't think that the Sanders vote in 2016 in Ward 16 was necessarily about Bernie Sanders. I think it was about Hillary Clinton. There was clearly a sentiment of resistance to Clinton that manifested itself later in November as well. Some of those precincts were pretty strong for Trump, even if they didn't end up voting for him. He got, it was close in Ward 16, and too close with the Trump vote there. But look, Bernie Sanders did win Savin Hill 13-10 in 2016 and lost it to Biden on Tuesday. He won as those precincts you mentioned in Ward 16 in 2016, but Joe Biden wasn't on the ballot then. He is now. And look, there's an affinity with those voters in Neponset, for instance, and in South Boston. There's still a strong Irish Catholic vote in those parts, that part of the city, as well as in West Roxbury. Joe Biden's an Irish Catholic. There hasn't been an Irish Catholic president since John F. Kennedy. There have obviously been presidents with Irish ancestry, including Barack Obama. But again, I think it does come back also to that brand, the Obama-Biden brand, which Biden is now using quite effectively on the stump. He keeps saying, I'm an Obama-Biden Democrat, I'm a lifelong Democrat. That resonates with voters who are themselves like that. They voted for him before, twice. And they indicated Tuesday they intend to do it again.
I grew up with the Kennedy idolatry in Boston, and so I remember what it's like.
Yeah.
It's not like that anymore with Biden because we take it for granted, maybe. So is this really going to help him that much nationwide if he is the nominee?
Well, I think in this primary it may have helped a bit here, right? Because you have a menu of options, and there are nuances to voters always, but there can be tribal instincts that kick in for better or for worse. And in the case of Irish America, it's an interesting dynamic. There are very few places left where I think it does matter, but Ireland is back in the news. So the number of Irish people here in Boston is significant. The number of them who go to Ireland every year is significant. I'm one of them, and so I understand why some of us do tune into what is this person thinking when it comes to our relations with Ireland. It's the next parish over here in Boston. It really is. For those of us with Irish ancestry, it can make a difference if there's a decision to be made.
I know this is a little outside Dorchester, but you do know your way around the city. Bernie Sanders did very well this year in East Boston, which he did not carry 4 years ago. He carried Alston and Brighton, which is not too much of a surprise, but there's been quite a jump in voter participation in that part of the city as well. What does that say to Biden about what he has to do? Well,
look, Biden obviously has to coalesce support now. He did so very well, very effectively with Klobuchar and Buttigieg coming on board. I do think that there's a difference this time. I know there's a lot of anxiety about whether Sanders people will exit the tent if he doesn't win. Now, that's a big if still. I think part of the motivation for going with Biden for moderates and for some people on the left too, a Warren voter who went to Biden is probably a left voter. Look, if it's a clean convention, if it's just a straight up victory for Biden, I don't think there's any danger of that. If there's some shenanigans at the convention, obviously that's a danger. But the big difference this year, Chris, from 2016 is that we know one thing that can happen that we didn't know in November 2016, and that's that Donald Trump can be elected. I don't think a lot of people believed that among the Democratic establishment. They figured Hillary would win. They were wrong, and everybody knows that now. It's a danger that can happen again. There will, I think, be a coalescing, no matter who it is, who's the nominee.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Bill Forry from the Dorchester Reporter. Bill, turning to another topic, cleaning up the Neponset River. There's a lot more public access. It looks nicer. It doesn't smell as bad as it used to. So why does it need to clean up?
Another issue here that's a federal one that the next president may have to attend to. The Neponset River over the centuries was polluted by industrial uses along the riverbank. Mills and factories that deposited
upstream in Hyde Park, I think.
Hyde Park and perhaps even in Dorchester and Mattapan. However, over the years, that sediment built up, especially behind dams that are still there along the river. That sediment is what's contaminated. Not so much the water, the fish life, but it's sediment that's contaminated. It needs to be dealt with. The EPA held a hearing a week and a half ago in Mattapan to kind of update people. They've been asked by the state to come in and do a study and then consider the Neponset River for what's called Superfund mitigation, which would make it eligible for new federal dollars to come in eventually. This is a long process, and actually mitigate that soil, go in and excavate it and remove it. So that's what that meeting was about. There will likely be a move to make the Neponset River, the lower Neponset River, between Lower Mills and High Park, a Superfund site.
And much, much sooner, there will be a pot shop on the border of Dorchester and Roxbury.
There will. Pure Oasis, which is in Grove Hall. It's going to be the first cannabis retail operation in the city of Boston. It's taken a long time, Chris. We were writing about this a year ago, and they got all their approvals, but there's been delays attendant with permitting and other regulatory issues at the state level, but they finally do have the green light, and they're going to open their doors on Monday. And
switching to a slightly different, your family puts out an Irish paper, and there's a slight difference in the name change and some other things going on.
25 years we published the Boston Irish Reporter, which was a monthly publication. We've now moved to a quarterly magazine form, which is called Boston Irish, and we're online heavily at bostonirish.com. So we're in the month of March. It's prime time for St. Patrick's Day fun and events all across the region. So if you want to learn more about it, you can go to bostonirish.com.
And of course, for Dorchester News, you've got the Twitter feed and the website, right?
.news.com, and you can find us at Twitter @.news.
Bill Forry, mostly from the Dorchester Reporter. In a moment, we'll tell you about a celebration of traditional Celtic music for St. Patrick's Day, but first, this message.